a couple of nights ago online, and we have a good article coming on it in the Weekly Standard, actually, by Lee Harris, so I recommend that to people. It's a very thoughtful and interesting speech. We can argue about whether he should or shouldn't have quoted the 14th century dialogue, the one sentence about Islam that he quotes, but the point of the speech, I just take 30 seconds on this, is he's trying to defend a certain kind of melding of religion and reason, which he claims has happened in the Catholic tradition, obviously. He defends the Greek tradition, Socrates, pre-Christians, and the way in which Christianity absorbed them. And basically he says there are two great errors we can fall into. One is a sort of very narrow, modern scientific or scientistic understanding of reason, where unless it's proven, you know, by mechanical causes, nothing could exist. So that, you know, he obviously wants to defend an older understanding of a reasonable universe against that. And secondly, he says the other error we could fall into is a kind of fanatical religion where we just throw reason aside. And he implies that Islam has not done as good a job as Christianity of absorbing a certain kind of rationalist tradition, which he's the bishop of the Roman Catholic Church. He's entitled to prefer his own church to Islam or to my religion, for that matter, to Judaism. So that was what the speech was about. I don't think it'll have that much lingering effect, though I do think what's really striking is that you now have lots of people in the Islamic world. I don't think it's anything close to a majority or huge numbers. You know, we talk about the big reaction, but what is it really? 100 people rallying here, 600 there, murder one place, unfortunately. But you know, you're not talking about, so far as one can tell, millions of people necessarily paying a lot of attention to some speech in which the Pope quotes a 14th century dialogue. But still, it is striking that, you know, they seem to take the position that no one can criticize their religion or beg to differ from it, even if you're not living in those countries. I mean, there is something unhealthy, I think, about a situation where it's bad enough when dictators, whether religious or not, prevent freedom of speech and freedom of worship in their own country. When they try to prevent other people from exercising their freedom of speech or intimidate people from doing so, it's really not healthy. And I was thinking about this earlier today, it really makes one realize the extent to which this is this element of Islam, and it's a small element, I believe, but a dangerous one, the jihadist element. It's not even content to sort of try to shape politics and the law in their own country. That's not something I would be happy with if Sharia law were imposed on everyone in Indonesia or Iraq or elsewhere. But nonetheless, that's one thing. But then they really, in a way, want to also export their intolerance. And that, I think in that respect, one has to stand up for the Danish cartoons, one has to stand up for the Pope, even if one doesn't agree particularly with what either of them said.
Aaron, did you want to follow up, or what do you think about the controversy? And do you think that this sector within the Islamic community is looking for an argument? Some might say picking a fight.
Mike, I think it's a little bit more serious with all the effigies of the Pope being burned in Lebanon and other areas of the Middle East, and churches being firebombed in Israel. I think that there's going to be a bigger backlash than I think a lot of people really are counting on. And but I agree completely that I think we're entitled to be critical, and we shouldn't have effigies of political figures being burned or any violence committed towards us just because we're being critical. But you know, I also looked at the speech that the Pope gave, and I thought that I agree it generally wasn't that bad. But then when you looked at the 14th century part that was taken and added into the speech, you know, I could understand how it could be perceived as a little, I don't know, offensive. But I don't know. I think there might be a bigger backlash. I know the Vatican stepped up security threefold, and that you know, special measures are being taken to ensure safety around Rome. So I don't know.
Thanks, Aaron. Appreciate the question. Let's stay in Denver. Amy White, who has the next question?
Clark.
Go ahead, Clark Boyer.
Hey, thanks for joining us, Mr. Kristol. It's good to have you. A lot of us in college and you know, a lot of people in America in general have traveled abroad, and I think many people would agree with me in saying that people around the world tend to have a pretty negative attitude concerning America's foreign policy and the way that we've conducted ourselves, especially post 9/11. We've spoken in this class in the past about how America has possibly lost some of the moral high ground which we had in the past. Is that at all important to the agenda of the neoconservative movement? And I mean, in terms of the PR about how others feel about America, is that important to you and to the neoconservative movement, is my question.
Yeah, it's important. I mean, partly it's a practical matter. You know, you need to get as much support as you can, and if people turn against your government or your country, that's obviously an unfortunate thing. On the other hand, I think one can overstate how popular we were in the past, and also how unpopular we are now. There are elections all around the world in democratic countries. Often there's a more pro-American and a more anti-American candidate. And if you just look at the results in the last few years, it's been very mixed. Germany moved from sort of anti-American to a more or less pro-American government by a narrow margin. Anti-American candidate won in Spain, but Australia and Japan, the pro-American candidates have won. I mean, it just turns out to be, I think, not that different from the way it was. And my own sense from traveling around some is that I don't see, people don't like Bush, especially in Europe. And we tend incidentally to say the world, but then it turns out that 90% of this is Europe. If you go to Japan and India, which are both not insubstantial countries, or China for that matter, I suspect there's no more anti-Americanism than there was 10 years ago. In India, there's much more pro-Americanism than there was 10 years ago. And they don't have a big problem with Bush. But in Europe, there's a kind of cultural clash with the president. He's religious, he's Texas, he's cowboy. Europeans don't like any of that. So I will grant that in Europe, we have something of a PR problem. But again, I don't think it's stopping them from cooperating with us in the war on terror. It's not stopping them from cooperating with us in Afghanistan. It's not leading to anti-American candidates winning everywhere. So I don't think it's as big a problem as some people do.
We'll go back to Pace University, and Chris Malone, a couple of questions from your students.
Great. Thanks, Steve. Our next question is from Omar. You sit here in front.
There's two parts to my question, and I'm going to jump on the torture issue. The first part was this morning there was a lot of Republican incumbents who were having discussions with the White House to unify the whole party, take one stance on the torture issue because the election day is coming up. My question is, because torture is more of a moral issue, have our politicians forgotten about the issues and all they really care about is winning? And the second part is, in reference to when we first found out about beheadings in Iraq and so on and so forth, the Republican Party was quick to say, these people are cowards, they're barbaric, this is why we're fighting them over there. What's the possibility that we actually committed torture first and they were just reacting to what we did first?
Zero possibility. Did Daniel Pearl torture someone in Pakistan? I mean, it's ridiculous. 9/11, I mean, no. And so we didn't torture anyone, or if there were few tiny isolated incidences, we punished them. And the fact is, the debate now is between two, it's a very complicated legal debate. It's not clear that, I believe nothing that Bush wants or that McCain wants is torture. It has to do with whether certain interrogation techniques violate the Geneva Convention or don't, or how you explain that they don't violate the Geneva Convention, I guess is really what they're arguing about, since I don't think McCain's position or the Democratic position is even that they wouldn't use sleep deprivation techniques, to take one that we know they use, or playing loud music and sort of disrupting people's peaceful lives to make them a little more susceptible to interrogation. But even on tougher techniques, which we've now repudiated, waterboarding and the like, I'm not willing to sit here and say that it wasn't legitimate to use that on Abu Zubaydah and other al-Qaeda high-value targets if that helped us get information that prevented terror attacks. So I really think the idea that there's any kind of moral equivalence is ridiculous. No country is pure. You have 150,000 soldiers, 10, 20,000 CIA agents engaged in difficult operations. Some of them are going to do things they shouldn't do. Some of them are just going to flat out do bad things, because in any huge group there's a certain number of people who just lose control or have bad character or whatever. But I mean, the comparison I think is really not fair. You have one group of terrorists who seek to murder innocent people, and you have a country that's gone pretty far, in our case, probably as far as any country in the history of the world fighting a war, to try not to go over the bounds of international law.
Chris Miller, I'm going to come back to you, but let me follow up on Omar's point again, because we're talking a lot in this class about politics, and maybe the Washington Post read your editorial because you wrote on Sunday that John McCain has badly damaged his 2008 presidential campaign bid, and that's the front page story today in the Washington Post. So with Omar's point about the detainee, why has this damaged John McCain within the Republican Party or within the base that he needs to get the nomination? I mean,
I was preferred McCain to Bush in 99 and 2000, so I say this not with any cheerfulness, really. I think most Republicans are probably with Bush against McCain on the question, which is a pretty narrow one. I'd put it this way. Should we err on the side of a little bit more in the way of tougher interrogation, sleep deprivation techniques, et cetera, offenses to what's it called, to human dignity, I think they're called, personal dignity, or should we really bend over backwards to treat terrorist detainees almost exactly as we would want prisoners of war to be treated. And that's the debate. I mean, it's really a pretty narrow debate, actually, between McCain and Bush. I just think most Republicans are with Bush. They think that if it's a close judgment call, why not defer to the president on this? They've been working hard on this issue since the Supreme Court decision. And I think McCain's hurt himself a little with his rhetoric, this kind of very moral, so his moral high horse, so to speak. This is a matter of conscience. This is a matter of whether we can hold our head high before the nations. We're fighting a bunch of brutal terrorists. We're trying to help decent Iraqi Democrats and decent Afghans to live in a decent society. The idea that if we use sleep deprivation, we're trying to save ourselves and Europeans and everyone else, Indians, from terrible acts of terror, mass murder. And the idea that, we can differ on whether we should use sleep deprivation techniques or not, and even waterboarding if you want to get to the tougher stuff. But the idea that one is sort of morally, the idea that that's an obvious moral call and that anyone who's on the other side lacks moral sensitivity, I think to the degree McCain has sort of conveyed that impression, I think he's offended, actually, a lot of, sort of normal Republican primary voters, and incidentally, I think a fair number of Democratic primary voters. The Bush legislation passed the House Armed Services Committee, was it 52-9 late last week?
Huge,
a lot of Democrats voted for it. I mean, this is not simply a bunch of right-wing Republicans who think that if you're dealing with terrorists, you are entitled to interrogate them, not just to read them their Miranda rights and say, go sit in a comfortable cell and we'll give you 3 meals a day.
Let's stay with Pace University. Next question for our guest, Bill Kristol.
Thanks, Steve. Omar wants to follow up, if that's okay, and then Rachel has the next question. Go ahead, Omar.
Okay. Sleep deprivation is one thing, but I was making reference to, if you read the Times this morning, we took a Canadian citizen without actually notifying Canada because we thought he had suspect ties to Al-Qaeda, flew him to Syria for a year and a half, and when he came back, after he was proved they had no links whatsoever, he was complaining that they were beating him with metal wires. If you look at the prisons in Iraq where they were taking the pictures and so on and so forth, that's not really sleep deprivation. That is, for me, a moral issue.
I myself am willing to be, we published an article against the CIA's practice of rendition, of sending people back to the country they came from, or in this case, I suppose, he was thought to have come from. Maybe that was inaccurate. I would say that one person being sent to Syria, not a very nice country, and being beaten for a year and a half is still a heck of a lot, which is the worst case in a way of rendition now, and was the front page story in the New York Times, is a heck of a lot different from the routine slaughter that's happening in Iraq by the jihadists.
Rachel, you had a question from Pace?
Hi, yes I did. My question is in regards to your statement in the past regarding conservatives believing that the Bush administration is incompetent, and how you think it's become in people's minds an emblem of the administration that just isn't as serious about the competent execution of the functions of government as it should be. Do you think that this will still have an effect on the primaries, for example, execution within New Orleans and Katrina?
Well, I think it could have an effect on the '06 elections. I mean, I think a lot of Americans would generally agree with the Bush administration's goals, but say they haven't done a good job of executing them, of following through, of preparing, hiring the best people, giving them the right resources. And whether it's Katrina or the war in Iraq, or I would say intelligence failures, it would be a fair charge to make. It would also be fair to say that no administration is perfect, and governing is hard, and every administration's made mistakes. But I think for various reasons, which I'm not even sure I understand, the Bush administration's been less, I don't know, somehow just less good at sort of making sure the government works as well as it should in a non-ideological way than it should have been. I think that will hurt Republicans some in 2006, though Bush himself isn't on the ballot, obviously. The interesting thing about 2008, if you're talking about the primaries for the presidency, is there's no one running from the Bush administration.
First time in
35. No, I think since 1952 that there's neither an incumbent president or an incumbent vice president on the ticket. And just to go a step beyond that, there's no one even particularly closely, the front runners in the Republican Party aren't even particularly closely associated with the Bush administration. McCain, Giuliani, Romney, Gingrich, a couple of senators, another governor or two. So it's 2008, from a political science point of view, if I can say that to the students, if you're in history or political science classes, will be a very interesting and unusual election. No incumbent on the president on the ballot, no incumbent vice president seeking to move up, wide open races in both parties. The Republican Party, the incumbent party, will run a candidate who won't look like an incumbent, in a sense. The Democratic Party has a front runner, actually, Hillary Clinton, I'm not so sure she'll actually get the nomination, but they'll have a